You know what you're listening to?
Is that a trick question?
It's the I Still Love This Game podcast with your host, Matthew Damian.
He's an idiot. Don't listen to this. He's an idiot.
Hello and welcome to episode 38 of the I Still Love This Game podcast. In today's episode, it should come as absolutely no surprise, it will be a playoff preview. And this is something that I wanted to do for quite some time, but obviously because of the state of the Western Conference and the Eastern Conference as well, for that matter, there was no way I could have possibly have predicted what the matchups and seedings were going to be. So I had to wait. I had to wait till the final day of the regular season. We got some great matchups, but not really great games. Obviously, the Denver and Minnesota playing game was interesting. We'll put it at that. It did go to overtime. But some of the other matchups were a bit disappointing. But those are behind us now, and we can actually have a look at the matchups. And let's begin in the Western Conference and the number one seed Houston Rockets going up against the Minnesota Timberwolves. Now, we all know the incredible season that Houston has had this season. They have, in my opinion, the surefire MVP in James Harden. And quite honestly, the only reason that that's even contested now is because the goalposts have been changing. And now people want to talk about totals instead of averages. And now because we're looking at totals, which is no way to judge a player, because if we're going off totals, then Karl Malone's the second greatest scorer in NBA history. Yeah, no, I don't think so. Or Mark Jackson is the third greatest passer in NBA history. Once again, I don't think so. So I will argue that till I'm blue in the face, that James Harden is the MVP. And I never thought those words would come out of my mouth, that I would argue it till I was blue in the face. Regardless, they are facing a team in Minnesota that has nothing to lose. So on that point alone, Houston has to be very wary of what Minnesota can throw at them. And of course, let's not forget, Minnesota has quite a lot of talent in positions that could potentially hurt Houston. So, I mean, you got Karl Anthony Towns, you got Taj Gibson, and you got Wiggins, all in the front court. And I haven't even mentioned their best player in Jimmy Butler. But you got that front court, and Houston's problem on paper is how are they going to stop scoring inside? And you got three guys that can hurt them. So if Minnesota can figure out and hit the glass, because they're not a real good offensive rebounding team in the regular season, but that gets thrown out the window. The playoff basketball, it doesn't matter what you did in the regular season, it's what you can do in your individual matchup. And if they can hit the glass and control the tempo a little bit, they may win one or two games in this series. But I think this is going to be a relatively short series. Houston, when they have the home court advantage in the first round, the last few years, whether it was up against Dallas or whether it was Oklahoma last year, they've taken care of business relatively quickly. So I think we'll see a similar situation here. Jimmy Butler's good enough to at least get them one win, but you'd have to really twist my arm to tell me that Minnesota's going to get more than one win. And the other thing you've got to take into account is Houston has pretty much played all their guys all the way through. That they haven't taken the foot off the accelerator or the gas pedal for my American listeners. They haven't taken the foot off the gas. They have played all the way through pretty much. I mean, they've managed their minutes relatively well. And this isn't a run-of-the-mill number one seed in the NBA playoffs. Houston has a massive chip on their shoulder, and rightly so, because of all the playoff failures from either D'Antoni, James Harden, or Chris Paul. The three biggest, or the three figureheads of this team. Their legacies all depend on at least getting to the NBA Finals. When you consider the season that they have had, if they don't make it to the NBA Finals, it's been a waste. It'll be a massive disappointment. And that's a hell of a pressure to put on a team that you better make the NBA, especially if you're in the West. And it'll be very interesting to see how they respond to that pressure. Because if they can dispatch Minnesota relatively quickly, then we might see if this team's for real or not. If they struggle, how are they going to handle a team like Oklahoma potentially in the second round, or Golden State in the round after, or the Miami Heat in the round after? I'm just kidding. I had to throw that in there. But yeah, no, I'm going to go with, I'm going to say that Houston takes care of business in 5 games. Wouldn't be shocked if it goes to 6, but I will predict 5. We're going to stay in the Western Conference, and we're going to go down to the number 2 seed versus the number 7 seed, and that's Golden State versus San Antonio. I did all that in one breath. I'm quite impressed with myself there. But this is probably the least intriguing series out of the entire bunch. I mean, if you threw Steph Curry and Kawhi Leonard into the mix here, then I'd really be interested. But I can't see this series really giving us a whole lot of moments. There is potential for San Antonio to cause an upset. The Warriors, here's a stat for you. If you're a Warriors fan, here's a stat for you that has to have you worried. In their last 10 games against playoff teams, in their last 10 games, they are 1-9. And that's with a minus 138 point differential. So they're getting crushed. It's not even close games. They're getting demolished. And they've really lucked out because San Antonio, at least on paper, is easily the worst team in the West. And of course, all that changes if Kawhi Leonard comes back, but he's not coming back. If he comes back, prove me wrong. I would love to see him come back. Even if he's not going to stick around in San Antonio for much longer. I would like to see him come back just because it'll make this playoff series a bit more exciting. Kawhi Leonard versus Kevin Durant's always a fantastic matchup. So they say styles make fights. It's the same with basketball. Kawhi Leonard's defense versus Kevin Durant's offense is always a spectacle. Now, in terms of this series, look, I want to get excited for this, but I kind of feel like the Warriors are a bit lost without Steph Curry. And as I said before, 1-9 in their last 10 10 regular season games against playoff teams is pretty. That's a large enough sample size to be really concerned with. But the Spurs, I don't think the Spurs can really push them. You've got LaMarcus Aldridge, then you've got a bunch of misfits or veteran players who have played way past their prime. So I think the Warriors escape, and I think, honestly, they lucked out by having to play San Antonio. Had they had to play anybody else, and this includes Minnesota or even Denver, I would be really concerned for them. But this is probably the best case scenario for them, and I can't see San Antonio winning more than one game. It sounds like I'm repeating myself because I just said the same thing for Minnesota. But I just don't think they have the consistent offensive firepower to run with them, and that's even without Steph Curry. So I'm going to go with Warriors in 5. Moving down to the number 3 seed, Portland versus number 6, New Orleans. This should be interesting because both these teams are total enigmas. I had Utah beating Portland, and I was once again wrong. I did put disclaimers all throughout that podcast that I was going to be completely wrong on most of those things. And that was the only thing I was right about, ironically. Portland has played so good since the All-Star game. But it's a total contrast. You have dominant players in the backcourt versus Anthony Davis up front. I think New Orleans can really push Portland. And this might be a case of where home court advantage means everything because it could go 7. I'm not convinced that either team will beat the other team on the road. So I think this will be a real good growing experience for New Orleans, and it'll force them into a decision that they have to make with DeMarcus Cousins. Do they really need DeMarcus Cousins? Because they've played better without DeMarcus Cousins this season. I wonder how many more times I can say DeMarcus Cousins in the next 30 seconds. But they've looked better. Their offenses look better. They're playing with more energy, and their pace is better. And that seems to be a better situation for Anthony Davis than when DeMarcus Cousins, for all his talent, he's got no idea how to play his position. You look at this guy, he's about 280 pounds, 7-footer, and he wants to play point guard. He wants to shoot threes. I don't know how many times I saw games early on in the season when they had both Rondo and Holiday on the court at the same time, and DeMarcus Cousins, off inbounds passes, would run to the baseline, which is the spot that point guards get the ball, to bring the ball up. Like, what's going on here? You know what would be hilarious? If he was to play alongside LeBron, you'd have these two massive players, 6'9", 6'10", 270 pounds, whatever, trying to play point guard. Poor Jose Calderon would have to be the big man, right? Anyway, I'm getting a little bit off topic. The point I was going to make is if they are highly competitive in this series against Portland without DeMarcus Cousins, does DeMarcus Cousins all of a sudden become trade bait? Could you offer DeMarcus Cousins potentially for Kawhi Leonard? Would that fit for both teams? Boy, I hope it does, because I would love nothing else than to see Popovich completely implode and see all kinds of If you thought what he did with Kawhi Leonard was bad in terms of covert tactics of manipulation to try and get him to play, imagine what would be unleashed if they bring in DeMarcus Cousins. But that'll be interesting to see in the future. But I'm really looking forward to this. Might be the playoff series in the West to watch out for in terms of just great basketball, competitive basketball. They could go, some close finishes and a long series. I will go with Portland in this series because I did say earlier that I think this could be a situation where the home team wins every game in this series. And because of that, I will go with Portland. You could also see a situation where it could be a 5-game series. Say if Portland is able to steal one of the first 2 games played in New Orleans, so games 3 or games 4. But I think each game has a potential of going to overtime or being decided in the final minute. So I'm excited for that series, and I think it'll be very close and very competitive. But I am going to go with Portland in that. And the final game, the final series in the West is Oklahoma with the 4 seed now up against Utah. And this too has the potential of being a very competitive and interesting series to check out. For all the talk about how Oklahoma underachieved, and this is how close the West was, they were 1 game away from being the 8th seed and 2 games away from being out of the playoffs entirely. Instead, they have the 4 seed and home court advantage up against Utah. And Utah, on the other end, has really excelled during a period where Oklahoma the wheels kind of fell off a bit. So after the All-Star game. And they obviously have Gobert, they have Favors, they have Joe Ingles, they have Mitchell, they have Rubio. They have players that sort of really fit in and they play. It's almost like a throwback to the 90s teams where you had guys in positions and those positions did specific roles on the court. Whereas Oklahoma, you've got Steven Adams that does that, but every other guy on the court pretty much does a variety of things. And this includes Westbrook, where they do it all, but sometimes they get in each other's way. So it'll be interesting to see how these styles will contrast. I think that Oklahoma, though, I've said this all year long, that this is a team that is built for the playoffs, and they will give any team headaches in the playoffs. And the reason I say that is the things that you do to defend this team, if you're the opposition, such as backing off Westbrook and packing the paint, or daring Carmelo Anthony to beat you from outside, that may work in a single game situation, but it's not going to work in a 7-game series. So you're playing with fire, and then it's almost like pick-up basketball in that, where you back off a guy that's an inconsistent shooter, and you're daring them to win, or to beat you, but that will work in a game of, 1st to 21. That's not going to work in a 7-game series, because eventually they're going to find their rhythm. And when you have that kind of talent, and I know that there's question marks now over Corey Brewer as well, so the depth is a bit of a problem. But we're talking about the playoffs now, where you have your rosters really go down to about 7 or 8 players. So they've got enough depth when you take into account Ferguson and Grant and Adams and Melo and George and Westbrook and Felton to get through and make an extended run here. But what I like about this series is we'll actually see how good Donovan Mitchell truly is, because he will be the number 1 option outside maybe Favors on offense in the half court for Utah. And let's see how he goes when he's going up against a backcourt of Russell Westbrook, who's shown in the last couple of weeks how seriously he's taking the defensive side of the ball, and Paul George, who's been a terrific defender all season long. That's a lot of pressure to put on a rookie to try and get through. Now, we've seen this before. We've seen Dwayne Wade do this before as a rookie, but Dwayne Wade really exploded in the playoffs. He didn't really have a great regular season as a rookie, but we have seen this before where rookies have taken over playoffs games and series. So it'll be interesting to watch. But I do think Oklahoma will get over the line. I think they'll win in 6, and then they'll advance to play Houston, and that'll be a rematch from last year, but not really, because the teams are so different. Chris Paul's on Houston, obviously, and Oklahoma has had a complete makeover in terms of their roster. So we can't look at that as a barometer as to how that series will go. I think Houston would beat Oklahoma in a playoff, in a best-of-7 series, just because they've got a lot more consistency on the offensive end. But that being said, if Oklahoma can get hot, and they've got players, I know a season is a huge sample size, but a career is an even bigger sample size. So if let's forget about the season for a second and look at the careers. If Russell Westbrook can get hot from mid-range as well as threes and play like he did last season, with a little bit more consistency with his jumper, and Carmelo can regain some form, Houston's going to have their hands full. That could be a 7-game playoff war. And I don't know where they could go. Oklahoma could knock them off. But I would go with Houston in that series. I mean, it's a flip of the coin stuff. Maybe not a flip of the coin, but 55% Houston, 45% Oklahoma, because there's so much talent. And if nothing else, Billy Donovan, who has been criticized quite a lot this season in his inability to get them to all mesh, in his first playoff run, he showed a great ability of scouting and seeking out the weaknesses of his opposition when they knocked off San Antonio, and then when they were up 3-1 on the 73-win Warriors teams. And I find he now has a roster that's comparable to that Kevin Durant, Russell Westbrook, Roberson, Ibaka lineup in terms of talent. So let's see what he can do now that he has a full assortment of weapons at his disposal, that he can tinker and work out how he wants to defend teams as well as exploit them on offense. If you underestimate Oklahoma based off their regular season, you do that at your peril, because this team could easily not only make the finals but win the championship. That being said, I'm picking Houston to beat them. And on the other end of the Western Conference, I had Golden State and Portland advancing. So, that's not a bad series, especially if Steph Curry returns. But it doesn't have the firepower or all the star power of Oklahoma versus Houston. There is some playoff history. A couple of years ago, the past 2 seasons, Golden State has knocked them off. But this Portland team has definitely matured, and they've played a lot better than expected. CJ McCollum might be their best offensive player in the half court. And what I mean offensive player, in terms of just scoring the basketball, and that includes, of course, Damian Lillard. But over this run where they've really asserted themselves, when I've seen CJ McCollum isolated, that seems to be their number one option. And Damian Lillard, to his credit, will pick and choose his spots a lot better. And they've become a lethal combination. And once again, it's such a good backcourt going up against also a good backcourt. But let's keep in mind what happened 2 years ago, not 1 season ago, but 2 years ago, when Steph Curry was coming back from injury, a similar injury to the one he's coming back from now. It was a knee injury. And it looked like Portland was on the verge of tying the series up. It was the Warriors had won the first 2 games, and then Game 3 was Portland's. They won him at home, and then Game 4, it took Steph Curry to really erupt in the fourth quarter to get them out of that mess, because otherwise they were going to be tied at 2. So everyone talks about the problems that they face against Oklahoma and obviously the Cavs, which they lost that series. But Portland was giving them everything they could handle as well throughout the first 4 games of that series. So Portland's not intimidated. We've seen Damian Lillard have some of his best games against Golden State. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make here is Portland has emerged throughout the regular season, much like Toronto has. So I think they're trying to test themselves as well, but there's not a whole lot of expectations or pressure, apart from the pressure that they put on themselves. And that's when teams can do some really great things. I do think it obviously come down to Steph Curry's health. If Steph Curry, look, Golden State is good enough to beat San Antonio with Steph Curry, or even an injured Steph Curry, right? But they are not good enough to get through Portland if Portland's playing up to the standard that we've seen over the last 2 months, unless if Steph Curry is playing at least at 75%. If he is stumbling and fumbling and he's not himself, they're going to lose, man. They will lose that series. So that will be interesting just to see how Golden State responds to the challenge, and also how Portland responds to that challenge. And it could be that even if Golden State gets through it, because just the pressure of the moment gets to Portland, Golden State just might be buying time before they get knocked off by either Oklahoma or obviously the Rockets. I will go with Golden State just because I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. but there's no way I would ever put money on that series because I've just got no confidence whatsoever in Steph Curry's health and Golden State's ability to win big games without him playing. Kevin Durant may be the focal point on offense, but Steph Curry is by far and away their most important player on offense. When he's rolling everybody, Klay Thompson looks better, Draymond Green looks better, and the entire court opens up for Kevin Durant in that situation. And if Kevin Durant cannot get to the conference finals without Steph Curry, but with Klay Thompson and Draymond Green, what does that say about him? What does it really say about him? Is he a winner, or did he just get carried by 3 other All-Stars and 2 Hall of Famers? I mean, that's not 5 players, by the way. 3 other All-Stars, 2 of which are Hall of Famers, I should say. But what does it say about him? And that, of course, leads us to the Western Conference Finals. And if my predictions are correct, which they probably won't be, but who knows, we'll have Houston versus Golden State in the conference finals, with Houston having the home court advantage. Now, depending on how much Portland pushes back, we could see Golden State on their last legs. If they're able to coast through Portland and manage Steph Curry and even potentially rest him in some games, just say they're up 3-0 in that series, they may rest him for Game 4 and then bring him back for Game 5. And Houston, let's be honest, they're going to go through a potential playoff war against Oklahoma if they're to match up with Oklahoma in the second round. And there's absolutely no guarantees in that situation either. But all things considered, I think Houston will beat... I think if Houston is healthy and Golden State is 100% healthy with Steph Curry, I would still pick Houston. For this very reason. One, they have a lot more... they have a chip on their shoulder. They have something to prove. Everyone wants to win, but there's a different sort of motivation when you have something to prove as opposed to trying to reach back. Unless if you've got like a guy like Michael Jordan or Kobe Bryant who is completely obsessed with winning. But with this Houston team, as I mentioned before, their legacy is now the only thing missing from D'Antoni's resume is a championship or getting to the finals. Chris Paul, the only thing missing from his resume is getting to the conference finals. James Harden, he's been to the finals before. He's been to the conference finals before. Both situations he played terribly. And you could say that he was one of the biggest reasons they lost both those series. Of course, he made the conference finals. Everyone knows that he made the NBA finals as a bench player for Oklahoma in 2012. But people forget that he made the conference finals in 2015 and played shockingly bad. Now, what I wanted to mention though is if they win a title together, those 3 guys, we forget pretty much a lot of that because they're considered winners and they're considered champions at that stage. And they would have had to earn it going through Oklahoma and then Golden State, and then who knows what's going to be waiting for them in the Eastern Conference. Maybe the Indiana Pacers. Oh, wait, no. Probably not the Pacers. Maybe the Raptors, maybe the Cavs. I don't know. It will be a tough series, but it definitely won't be as tough as Oklahoma or Golden State. But the point that I'm making is they would have had to earn this championship. Just the same way that if Golden State gets through and wins again, whoever's winning the title this year would have had to earn it. And that goes for any team. Now, so that's one reason that I like Houston over Golden State. The other reason is you look at the style that they play with. And for the first time, and I've said this a few times throughout previous episodes of the podcast, but for the first time since Golden State has emerged as a championship quality team, and also not just a championship quality team, but they've won the title twice. We've seen a team come along where they've actually we've got to slow the pace down a little bit. And they do have to slow the pace down against the Rockets. I don't think they can handle the Rockets in a fast-paced game or even in the half court. They don't have the defenders. Now, you've got Kevin Durant, who's emerged a little bit as a defender. And you've got Draymond Green, obviously. Klay Thompson is an okay defender. But beyond that, there's not a whole lot there. But you look at the depth that Houston has, whether it's Harden or Chris Paul or Eric Gordon, those 3 alone can give you, obviously Harden gives you 25 to 30 every night, but Chris Paul and Gordon, they can also give you 25, 30 on any given night. And multiple times they can do that in a playoff series as well. Then you've also got Capella who does damage. You've got Ariza who does damage. You've got Ryan Anderson who can do damage. There are a lot of players. You've got Joe Johnson. You've got Gerald Green. There are a lot of players that can score the ball. I don't think Golden State extends that deep in terms of their defensive talent. I don't think they can match up with them. I think that this could be a very short series, but what I really think will happen is... So it could either be a short series where Houston just annihilates them, or you'll see exactly how good Golden State is. And Golden State needs this. They need this so bad. They need to be validated, and they need to be tested. Just like the Lakers needed to be tested against the Sacramento Kings. They needed that to sort of validate that, hey, they weren't just running over older teams or teams that had to start Terry Porter like the San Antonio Spurs in the conference finals. They needed to be tested up against Chris Webber and Mike Bibby and Vlade Divac and those guys. They needed that. So we'll see how they respond to the challenge there. I'm not sure if they can do that. But we shall see. It will be entertaining basketball. I hope it's the latter. I don't want to see a short series because this is really the NBA Finals. I want to see a long series where both teams have to dig deep to beat the other one. But if we're just looking at it on paper, I think Houston has them. I think it's kind of like, if I can throw a tennis analogy into this. Rafael Nadal was built to beat Roger Federer because he was younger than him. He saw Federer ahead of him and he built his game. And that's why Nadal has such an impressive record against Roger Federer, because he knows how to beat him. He built his game up to counter what Federer does well. So Federer is obviously a brilliant stroke maker, but Nadal, whether it's on clay court or hard court or grass, notice he'll stand 2 or 3 feet behind the baseline and he'll just out-duel him. And it forces Federer to hit 5, 6, 7 brilliant shots in order to win a point. And more times than not, it will lead to Federer just... You can't do that. It's like asking somebody to make 5 or 6 straight jump shots contested. It's a really difficult thing to do in tennis on all surfaces. And that's why he was able to dominate. And then you had Djokovic who came along and he built his game in order to beat both Federer and Nadal. And that's why he's got such an impressive record against both of those guys. And of course then you had Andy Murray who we thought was who was the answer to Djokovic, and that didn't work out at all. So my point is that this team is completely built to take out Golden State. Now, of course, and then it comes down to the mind games. And coaching will play a factor, but not the way you're thinking. I don't think Steve Kerr's a good coach, and I think he's probably going to be exposed as a bad coach if he, just sort of sits there with his legs crossed like he did throughout the first 3 games of the NBA Finals in 2015, when Matthew Dellavedova and Tristan Thompson and Mozgov, along with, of course, LeBron James, were absolutely dominating such a talented team in the Warriors. I will say that Houston would win that series, though. I will go with that, and I think Houston will go on to the NBA Finals. Now let's have a look at the mighty Eastern Conference. And the first playoff series is actually going to be quite a good one, I think. It'll be the Raptors versus the Wizards. As I mentioned in yesterday's podcast, that Washington, there is a playoff history there, and Washington swept them emphatically in, I think it was 2015, or it may have been 2014. I can't remember. I'm going to go with 2015, but that was the year that Paul Pierce was on their roster. And you might be thinking, well, that was a few years ago. Teams have sort of changed, but there's Kyle Lowry's still there, DeRozan's still there, Bradley Beal's still there, Gortat's still there, John Wall obviously is still there. So there's quite a bit of a leftover on both rosters, especially core players, for that to be relevant. Toronto has been stumbling a little bit, and everyone is quick to point that out, but they haven't been stumbling nearly as bad as the Wizards have been. That being said, the Wizards, they kind of remind me of Oklahoma they're the Eastern Conference version of the Oklahoma City Thunder. And what I mean by that is this team is built for the playoffs. You have players that are typically designed for the playoffs. And they are a tough matchup for anybody in the Eastern Conference. I would like to think that Toronto gets over the line here, though. as much as I have, been critical of the Raptors over the years, wouldn't that just be so heartbreaking for the Raptors for them to win what? I think it was 58 games. It might have been 59. They got close to 60. The second best record in the NBA. And then to lose in the first round, wouldn't that be just absolutely horrible? I would feel terrible about the Raptors and the Raptors fans getting knocked out in the first round. That would, I think you would have to blow up the team at that point. I don't think you could ever recover from that. I don't even know what else to say to that. I will pick the Raptors, but I think the Wizards could extend this to potentially a 7-game series. And that won't be an indication of how badly the Raptors are doing, because the Wizards have a very talented team. Of all the first round matchups, if you look at the East, for example, okay, you got Cleveland versus Indiana, you got Philly versus Miami, you got Boston versus Milwaukee. Toronto, despite being the number 1 seed, they have the worst or the toughest matchup for teams with home court advantage as opposed to underdogs. So Cleveland has Indiana. Indiana's not as good as Washington. Philly has Miami. Miami is not as good as Washington. Boston has Milwaukee, and Milwaukee has not played as good as Washington. They've actually been sliding worse than what Washington has been. So I will pick Toronto, and if it does go into a long series, I'm not going to hold that against them, because the Wizards do match up quite well with them, and they have a history with them, and they also have a history of playing relatively well in the playoffs, barring injuries. Let's move along to the number 2 seed, Boston Celtics up against Milwaukee, and I don't know. I don't know what to say about this. Kyrie Irving being injured just kills this. It would have been such a fun series, especially if they played the games at the Mecca, out at Milwaukee like they did earlier on in the season. That one game, that retro game. If they just played the home games there, that would have been fun. Obviously that wouldn't happen though, but it would have been interesting. Honestly, I think Milwaukee might win this series. I think Boston has to face reality here, and it might just be the best outcome for them would be to just give as much playoff experience to Brown and Tatum, because they're not going to go anywhere. Even if they make it to the next round, I don't trust them to advance. And you've got a lot of talent. If you line up the two rosters, if you didn't know that Boston was the number 2 seed and Milwaukee was the number 7 seed, and you just looked at the rosters, you would think that Milwaukee would be the number 2 seed and Boston would be the number 7. Look, for all the struggles that Milwaukee has shown throughout the regular season, they play well in the playoffs. They pushed Chicago when Chicago had a pretty decent team. I think Chicago was one of the worst officiated / rigged series was the 2015 series against Cleveland. And they pushed that Chicago team to 6 games after Chicago was up 3 games to none. So that they know how to play hard. And of course, last year's playoffs, I think Toronto got really lucky in winning that series. I think Milwaukee had the potential to completely dominate Toronto, but they just didn't have the mental edge. Giannis has obviously evolved. You've got Bledsoe, and you've got a bunch of players that can really hurt Boston right now, because Boston's never been a strong rebounding team. They brought in Monroe, I get that, but I don't think he's the answer. And when you have a front court as big as what you've got, and you've got guys coming off the bench like Thon Maker who can really impact, don't laugh, he can really impact a game in terms of his energy and his play around the basket. I just don't see a whole lot of situations. I think Boston's coaching and their energy level, especially at home, can win them a couple of games, and it could go to 6. But I think Milwaukee does win this series. And I say that with a heavy heart, because the Eastern Conference would have been a much more fun situation if Kyrie Irving was around, because Kyrie Irving really could have. It would have been a great test to see how he would have gone up against this Milwaukee team, and then potentially against that Philly team, and then potentially against either Toronto or Cleveland. But we do have to move on from that situation, and let's move on to the next round, or not the next round, but the next series, and that's Philly versus Miami. And that's a total contrast in styles. You got a veteran. People like to hang a lot of crap on Spoelstra, and they think he wasn't a good coach. I think I heard someone refer to him as a kid coach the other day when he was winning titles with Miami. But let's look at with LeBron. But let's look at what he's done in the last 2 seasons. Out of nowhere, like an RKO, Miami really turned it around last season with Dion Waiters, and they were able to emerge as a threat to even make the playoffs. I thought Spoelstra probably should have been Coach of the Year last year. You can make an argument for him being Coach of the Year this year too, with what he's had to work with. Now, they're going to go up against Philly, and everybody, I've raved about Philly the last podcast, but this is a kind of a nightmare matchup for Philly because you've got a team that's physical. And Philly, despite Embiid and the ability that he has to bang down low, they're a shooting team, they're a finesse team, they like to move the ball around. It'll be interesting what they do once they've been punched in the mouth a few times. Of course, metaphorically speaking, that would never happen in today's game. But once a team actually gets after him and defends him and plays a little bit physical, probably a lot more physical than they are comfortable to playing, that's being Philly, it'll be interesting to see because this is a young team. And a lot of these guys, with the exception of probably JJ Redick, have never experienced playoff action before. So how they respond to that is anybody's guess. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if Miami actually causes an upset here, because Miami is the worst matchup they could have possibly had. Because not only can they defend the perimeter, you've also got Hassan Whiteside, who has been very quiet this year, but this is his opportunity to redeem that by going up and shutting down, or at least putting the clamps on Joel Embiid. And if he's able to do that, what consistent offensive options do they have in terms of just scoring? Not ball movement and occasionally getting, a guy hot, but what consistent offensive options do they have in terms of scoring, this being Philly, over a 7-game series? They could be in trouble here. I do like Philly, though, to emerge from this because I think they have a little bit more offensive consistency than what Miami does. But Miami's style gives them a very good chance to win this series. I think this could go 7. And if it does go 7, Philly, that could be the best thing that could happen to Philly if they want to make this a long playoff run. Because if it goes 7, they would have had to really scratch and claw their way through a veteran team that, you got championship experience from the coaching as well as the players. I mean, let's not forget Dwayne Wade's on this team as well. This could be the best thing going forward for Philly is if it is a long series. So we've had 3 series so far in the Eastern Conference. All 3 are quite interesting. We can't maintain that, however, because Cleveland versus Indiana, I don't think that's going to be overly interesting. Indiana will probably win 1 game at home, but when you've got LeBron playing pretty well, especially on offense, playing fantastic on offense, playing very mediocre on defense, and that's being very nice to him. You got Kevin Love, and you got the other pieces meshing together. I would say that this series would probably go 7 if LeBron wasn't playing. So if you take LeBron out of Cleveland, and you had Kevin Love, and you had all the other players for Cleveland up against Indiana, I think they would still win in 7. So of course you add LeBron, and I think this is a sweep. If it's not a sweep, it's a 5-game series. There's not a whole lot here to be excited about, but there's one thing that I did want to mention. This is the ultimate test for Oladipo and the Oladipo-Paul George trade. Everyone has said that Indiana surprisingly has got the better from that trade. And the reason they say that is because Indiana has an improved record. They finished as a higher seed. They were the 7th seed last year. But they're facing a Cleveland team who is worse. Of course, no Kyrie Irving. We all know who to thank for that, right? Mr. LeBron James. But regardless, they're facing up against LeBron, Kevin Love, J.R. Smith, a lot of the same guys, right? So let's see how good they are. Indiana was quite competitive in some of those games. It came down to a final second shot. I think it was in game 1 or game 2 that CJ Miles took and very nearly made. And then I think it was game 3. They were up by about 24 points in it could have been the second quarter. It might have been the third quarter. And Cleveland came storming back to win that game. And then they went on to win the series in 4. So what I wanted to say is even though that was a sweep, they were competitive games. So I want to see how Indiana does now with Oladipo instead of Paul George up against this Cavs team, and let's see if they actually have improved. That's the one thing that I can get from this series. Apart from that, I can't find anything interesting in it. So if you're not a fan of the Cavs or the Pacers, maybe look for that. If not, I don't know, buy Pat Riley's book and read it, play some Xbox, or continue to listen to my podcast. So if we're going from the number 1 seed now in the East, based on my predictions once again, which I'm probably going to get wrong. So we'd have the Raptors versus the Cavs. Oh boy, if you're Toronto, oh boy, indeed. And I say oh boy, but maybe this is what you need. Maybe you need to get it out of your system. You've got to believe if you're Toronto, you would have had to go through Cleveland at some point anyway. Whether it's the conference finals or the first round or the second round, you would have had to go through them if you want to get to the NBA finals. And maybe beating them in the second round is a better situation than the conference finals because you've got all the pressure. It's even more amplified at that stage because you've got a direct trip to the NBA finals on the line. Whereas if you're in the second round, you've still got another series before that pressure amounts, right? Plenty of players have said, including Larry Bird, that there's a big, the further you get along in the playoffs, especially for teams that haven't reached certain rounds, the pressure is amplified. And he was referring to the 97 Utah Jazz when he was saying that. He said there's a big difference between the conference finals and the NBA finals because the Jazz had never made the NBA finals before that season. So they would have had to go through them, and this is a big test for them. And we've seen them emerge a little bit in the regular season. They sort of, I wouldn't say they derailed, but they definitely slowed down and stalled a little bit towards the end of the season. But I've said for quite some time now that this team is capable of winning the title, but they're also capable of losing in the first or second round. Nothing would surprise me with this Toronto Raptors team. And the only way we're going to find out is how good they are is how they're tested. And if they're going to have to go through through the Cavs, then so be it. They have to go through the Cavs, and it's going to be in the second round. They should embrace that. Now, if they get scared and they clam up and they play tight, they've got no chance. They've got no chance at all. And if that happens again for a third straight year, then Casey's got to go. He would just have to go at that stage. Because you need the team, it's kind of like Doug Collins, Phil Jackson. The team can only go so far with that Chicago Bulls team before you make a move and install a new coach that can get them over that hump. In addition to it, this might be the Raptors' best chance, or maybe their only chance, to getting to the finals and competing for a title. Kyrie Irving is out. The Philadelphia 76ers essentially have 2 rookies leading them. Embiid, to me, feels like a rookie, even though it's his third year technically in the league. Before this season, he only played something like 25 games combined. And then you have not the Raptors, you have the Cavaliers, who are playing their worst basketball since LeBron decided to come back home. So this is their best opportunity to do it. And I'm not sure even if LeBron goes west next year, which, I don't know, it's possible, semi-possible, with the emergence of Philly and Boston, and also other teams that have the ability to get better, such as Milwaukee and Washington, I'm not sure if Toronto can compete with those teams if there's more depth. So this is their opportunity. I don't think they'll do it. I'll be honest with you. I think Cleveland will win it. I think Cleveland will take them out. I think they will shrivel. I think as they have done in many years past. I hope I'm wrong. I want to see them do well. You heard the pain in my voice a second ago when I was talking about the potential of them losing in the first round. I hope they're not satisfied with saying, oh, well, we lost to LeBron again. He's a pretty good player. He's a top 10 player of all time. They'll probably say he's the greatest player of all time or the top 3 or whatever. But he's really a top 10 player of all time. And they'll accept it. That's not good enough. They have a team that is capable of beating them. It's all mental. And if they come underprepared and underperform again, that is not good enough. I will be I will not take that as an excuse that they lost to LeBron, because there's teams that Kobe Bryant lost to, like Phoenix, for example, when they didn't have Amari Stoudemire. That was You didn't see Phoenix say, "Well, we lost to LA because they had Kobe." No, they said, "No, we're going to compete. We're going to play hard, and we're going to beat them." And they did beat them twice in the first round. So that's not good. I won't accept that. But unfortunately, I think I probably will have to accept it because that's probably the way it's going to come out. I think Cleveland will take one of the first two games, and then they won't be beaten at home, and they'll win it in 6. In the other conference semi-final, you'll have Philly versus Milwaukee, but Philly will have the home court advantage. Actually, in my scenario, Philly will have the home court advantage in all 3 rounds because I've got Cleveland advancing. So they've got Milwaukee in the second round, and Philadelphia definitely tougher than if they were to play Boston, because the best player in that series is still Giannis. Suddenly they're going to be playing with a bit more confidence, knowing that they're into the second round now, something that Giannis is yet to do. Something Milwaukee's hasn't done in, I don't know, was 2001 the last time that Milwaukee made the second round? Anyway, they'll have a bit of confidence and they'll be rolling, but I don't think they'll be able to, Philly will be rolling as well at that stage. This weakness for Philly will be lack of experience, but quite frankly, Milwaukee doesn't have that much experience either. Their core group of players, with the exception, I guess, if you want to say Dellavedova, and he's not really part of that core group. He's more of an assistant coach than anything right now that just plays a role coming off the bench. But that core group hasn't done anything in the playoffs either. So that'll be interesting because neither team really knows better. And when it comes down to that, it comes down to pure talent. I think Philadelphia has a more balanced team in terms of talent and also home court advantage. I think they may be inspired a little bit by the home court advantage. Philly's a much more basketball passionate city than what Milwaukee is, and that will get them over the line. This leads us into the conference finals, which will be Philadelphia once again with home court advantage up against Cleveland. People want to talk about the similarities between Ben Simmons and LeBron James, but these two teams are complete contrasts. One's an exciting, young, up-and-coming, full of vibrance in Philadelphia, and the other one is a methodical veteran that know the system, know the procedures, they know what they need to do to win games and win series in Cleveland. And I think, that they'll give Cleveland a pretty good scare because Cleveland doesn't have a real counter to that except for experience. And I think that they may lose a couple of games by 20 to 30 points, but they'll win that series, and they'll probably win it in 6 games. And it'll be an interesting series to watch just because of the contrast. And it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest if Philly actually wins, because they don't know any better. They don't know to be intimidated. They don't know what a golden opportunity they actually have in front of them. Some teams will go, some players will go their entire careers without getting this kind of opportunity. And this is really the first year, as I've said a few times, for not just Ben Simmons, but also Embiid. They don't seem to be intimidated by it. So that would be interesting, but I do have Cleveland winning. And then, of course, Cleveland will advance to play Houston. Houston doesn't really have an answer for LeBron the same way they don't really have an answer for Kevin Durant. Not from an individual defender standpoint. I mean, you've got Ariza, you've got Tucker, that's about it. I mean, who else do you throw? Maybe Capella? But that's a worry. That's going to be a problem for them. But on the other side of the ball, who does Cleveland have to slow down Eric Gordon, Chris Paul, James Harden? I don't even think they can slow down one, let alone 3 of them. And I think Houston will end up taking that series probably in 6 really tough games. Not too dissimilar to Golden State's first championship over Cleveland. And maybe Cleveland jumps out early, gets a 2-1 lead once again, but they just don't have enough to keep it going. So guys, that's my playoff preview. 50 minutes in. I hope you enjoyed it. I've lost my voice by the end of it. I'm going to be taking a little bit of a break with the podcast. I'm going to say a little bit. I'm talking about a couple of days, unless if something big happens. But expect at least 2 episodes per week until we get to the conference finals, and then we may even be doing more than that. So thanks so much for your support. I hope you enjoyed this show. It's been a fun regular season to be doing this, and now it's just getting, it's just like the NBA teams are kicking into an extra gear for the playoffs. We'll be doing the same. Thanks so much, and take care, guys.